Welcome, everyone, as we get started and people log on. It is my privilege to welcome everyone to this webinar where we'll be learning about climate advocacy from Jane Mellet at Trocaire. Many of you are aware of Catholic Relief Services and know that I am the faculty co-chair of our St. John CRS Global Campus Committee. You've heard a lot about Catholic Relief Services on campus over the years. Trocaire is Ireland's member of Caritas Internationalis, which is essentially the equivalent of CRS in Ireland. And so we are really excited for today's webinar, looking at the right to a healthy environment and the COP30 Climate Summit and faith-based advocacy on behalf of climate. We always begin with prayer. I'm a little flustered because my computer crashed right before we began. And so I ask that we simply pause. And while generally our prayer ties to what we're talking about on a particular day, but with what is going on in the world right now, I ask that we all pause and, in particular, um, pray for peace and an end to violence, to the damage being done to people and to the planet, and for that there can be peace and the beginning of building just communities in the aftermath of conflict for all of the people who are experiencing conflict right now, especially those this morning in southern Lebanon in particular, who are who are experiencing violence. And we ask that, in particular, the priest who was killed this morning, um, that we remember his witness and staying with his community in the wake of being told that they are forced to migrate. Um, and so we ask for all in the entire region that peace might be possible and that we can have diplomatic and dialogue solutions to the conflict that is being experienced right now. As I said, we have with us today Jane Mellet from Trocaire, Ireland. Um, Jane is currently the church outreach manager. She has a particular interest in eco-theology, eco-spirituality, particularly spends a lot of time sharing the wisdom of Laudato Si. She was before that the Laudato Si manager for Trocaire. She's worked with the global Laudato Si movement. She's a climate activist and a spiritual director, and has degrees from St. Patrick's Pontifical University in Maynooth, Ireland. I hope I read that correctly, which is where Trocaire's offices are housed. I welcome you on behalf of everyone at St. John's, and I'm going to turn it over to you, and then we have a couple of students who will get us started once we move into discussion. But everyone else who is participating, please, the chat is open for you to put your questions, and when it comes time to the questions, I will take some from the chat as well. Jane, welcome, and you should be able to share your screen, and I turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Megan. It's lovely to be here and thank you for the invitation. Um, so yeah, I'm based in Ireland. Trocaire is based in St. Pat's Maynooth, as Megan mentioned. And we met there a few years ago, which was great. So Megan asked me to share a little bit on my recent, well, not recent, it was back in November, experience at COP30 in Brazil. And so I'm going to share on that this evening. more so from the perspective of faith-based advocacy. I'll say a little bit about what happened at the COP as well in terms of policy and all that. But so my own interest and my own expertise is in the faith-based side of the movement. Um, just a little bit about our work in this context. I work for Trocaire, but we partner very closely with the Laudato Si movement, which is a global movement to try and promote Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si on care for a common home. And there are tens of thousands of people involved in this global movement. So our work very much comes together quite a bit. And hopefully most of you are aware of Laudato Si, which um, was published 11 years ago and is a beautifully rich document rooted and grounded in the spirituality of Saint Francis of Assisi and really inviting us into an ecological conversion where we put on the lens of Saint Francis as we look out at the world and reflect on our relationship with God's creation and how we might care for it more deeply. So it's a document that brings together the science, this beautifully rich spirituality and the theology, and really invites all of the disciplines to come together to protect our common home. And you might be aware as well, it's addressed to every single person in the world. It's not just addressed to Catholics, because Pope Francis says at the opening piece, he says, this is a situation that affects all of us and the world we share. So there's just a little quote from the beginning of the encyclical there where he says St. Francis of Assisi reminds us that our common home is like a sister with whom we share our life and a beautiful mother who opens her arms to embrace us. So he's from the outset inviting us to look out at creation and to see the whole world as family, brother sun, sister moon, sister water, brother wind, all of these beautiful images that are used. But there's also some really serious calls in Laudato Si, and this will bring us into the COP piece. Um, he's asking us to read the signs of the times in light of the gospel in the spirit of Vatican II. And when we look out at the world, what are those signs of the times? And it's pretty obvious, especially at the moment. You can't avoid um, the news around climate change, biodiversity loss, the poly crises that are out there, and what's driving those crises. So he asks us to listen to the cry of the earth, the cry of the poor who are most affected by these crises, to listen to the science, to listen to the call of our faith, and to listen to the youth of the world. Um, and I suppose we can watch for those signs around us each day. Um, and the call of Laudato Si is to ecological conversion. So he says the external deserts in the world are growing because the internal deserts have become so vast. For this reason, the ecological crisis is a summons to a profound interior conversion. So he's really calling for this movement of the heart, where we begin to see and examine our relationship with creation and answer the call to be the protector of God's handiwork. So this conversion, it's a very personal thing. It's a communal conversion as well because it involves us personally, but also the networks that we share, our family, our friends, our faith community, on a national level and on an international level. We are all in need of this conversion right now. And it's ongoing, it doesn't stop there. So this call to ecological conversion is hugely important throughout the document. And I don't claim to be a climate scientist, but you don't need to be to see these numbers. Um, CO2 emissions are the driver of the suffering that is caused by the climate crisis. I suppose the bottom line of it, those CO2 emissions coming mostly from coal, oil, and gas, 70% of global emissions caused by just 100 companies, most of them fossil fuel companies. So the science tells us that for safe levels of CO2 in our atmosphere, they measure that at 350 parts per million. and that is for the delicate balance with which life on Earth is held, and for this living Earth community to flourish, that we shouldn't exceed that magic number. But we know that over the last few decades in particular, those levels have shot up and they continue to rise. And every time I use this slide, I have to change the number. I go back onto the CO2 Earth website and have to revise that number upward. So we're currently at 431 parts per million, which is well beyond what's deemed safe for life to flourish in our world. So the answer to that problem is we stop pumping these carbon emissions into our atmosphere. That's driving so much of the suffering related to climate change in our world. So this is where the COP comes in. Like, what is the COP? So for the last 3 decades, world leaders have met annually to address and respond to the climate emergency. And under the 1992 UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So these are the letters you see all over the place. The UNFCCC, um, or as most people call it, the COP, the Conference of Parties for the UNFCCC. And every country involved is treaty bound to avoid dangerous climate change. That's the purpose of the COP, to find ways to reduce these emissions globally, and in an equitable way. And a few notable meetings over the last 3 decades would include COP3, where the Kyoto Protocol was signed, and obviously the famous one, COP21, in Paris in 2015, which is the legally binding treaty on climate change, signed by 196 parties initially, although we know some key players are stepping away from it, with the goal to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees, preferably 1.5, compared to pre-industrial levels. So this is the attempt of the nations of our world to come together to stop this CO2 number from rising further and contributing to so many disasters globally. Just an interesting thing about COP21, it's the same year that Advocacy was published. So Advocacy was published very timely, um, like 6 months before that COP21, and it said that it led to the signing of the Paris Agreement because the politicians and leaders were grappling with the heavy issues, and Laudato Si really brought home the fact that this was a moral and ethical imperative, that isn't just a legal binding treaty. This is something that is a deeply moral issue, and the faith space started to open up, I guess, at the COP. So COP30 was in Belém, Brazil, last November, and the next COP31 will be in Turkey. So there's huge criticisms of the COP process, and I'll mention some of them in a few minutes. But I suppose the fact that we're at COP31 tells its own story. Progress is extremely slow. Are we going to end up at COP100 with these issues still burning, pardon the pun? Um, and when you're trying to negotiate with over 190 states globally, it is going to be slow and it's going to be extremely complicated. But the real issue here is we don't have time for the slowness, that the crisis is so urgent that the little progress that is made every year is not enough to meet the urgency that we face. And then just to mention, last year there was an important signing at the International Court of Justice, um, which declared that all states have a binding legal duty to prevent climate harm and protect human rights from the impacts of climate change. And they confirmed what the Paris Agreement had set out 11 years ago, that the 1.5-degree commitment made in Paris is the maximum warming limit that the world must stay within. So this is the magic number. We must not overshoot 1.5 degrees of warming. That had come into question, particularly since a lot of the science is now saying we're headed for 2 degrees. And if the COP agreement was to remain where it is at present, that would be 3 degrees or more, which would be um, disastrous for many states around the world, especially the low-lying island states. So they put the emphasis on each nation, um, each country setting national climate plans that reflect their highest possible ambition. So it's not just, oh, you should do what, a little bit to try and avert these climate disasters. It's that each country has to aim for the highest ambition possible to limit emissions per country. And they acknowledge that fossil fuels are the leading cause of climate change. So one of the huge criticisms of COP30 or any of the COPs is that it wasn't until COP28, so 28 years into the negotiations, that fossil fuels were even mentioned in the final draft of the report at the end of the conference. And there's lots of reasons for that. Some of it is that at the COPs there are a huge presence of fossil fuel lobbyists. So in Belém, at COP31 or COP30 rather, 1,600 people present inside the negotiations were fossil fuel lobbyists. So that was 1 in 25 people who attended COP30 was a fossil fuel lobbyist. So there's a whole movement there called Kick the Polluters Out to try and prevent these lobbyists from being allowed access to the conference. Um, so that's part of it's not all problems with it, but it is part of the problem. Just want to share a little bit on my own journey into this. In 2018, I was invited on a pilgrimage to COP24, which was taking place in Poland. And this was a climate pilgrimage. And it was taking the message of Laudato Si from Rome, from the Vatican in Rome, to Katowice in Poland. And I walked with a group of climate activists who were mostly from the Philippines. Um, and connected to Greenpeace and the Laudato Si movement. And we walked across 6 countries in winter in Europe. So it was quite cold to try and bring the message of Laudato Si to everyone we met along the way. And I suppose this was really part of my own deeper ecological conversion. I was always concerned about climate, um, but something I suppose deepened in me on this pilgrimage, mostly because I was walking with people who were survivors of Typhoon Haiyan, which had hit the Philippines back in 2013. This is still known as one of the strongest storms to ever make landfall in history. Um, Killed over 10,000 people, displaced millions of others. And the people I was walking with on this pilgrimage had lost um, a lot of family members, everything that was dear to them destroyed. And I suppose while we were carrying that message of Laudato Si and carrying these very painful stories, a question arose for me and has stayed with me ever since. And that question was, what does love of neighbor look like in an era of ecological breakdown? So, as a Christian, as Catholic, as someone who cares deeply about Laudato Si and climate justice, this was a very key question for me because, of course, we follow the gospel message and the teachings of Jesus, and we look out for the preferential option for the poor and work for justice in our world. That's what we're about. But we cannot not include questions around ecological justice now, because the impact and effect on the most vulnerable people in our world is so great. And more than that as well, this is part of our Christian vocation. Pope Francis says that in Laudato Si. Um, he's very explicit about it. He says this can no longer be considered an optional extra to our faith. It's part of our vocation as followers of Jesus. So that was an important, I suppose, moment for me on this. Also, when we got to the COP, there was this realization that, oh, this isn't a space that's necessarily going to bring about urgent solutions, which was quite a revelation to me. And Pope Francis hit out about this in Laudato Si as well. He says there, it's remarkable how weak international political responses have been. The failure of global summits on the environment make it plain that our politics are subject to technology and finance. So he's just hinting there at I suppose, the lack of political will um, because our focus is elsewhere on technology and finance in terms of our progress um, as a global community. So in Ladano C, he was quite clear. He says, we know that technology based on the use of highly polluting fossil fuels needs to be progressively replaced without delay. And he said even more than that a few years later when he met the CEOs of the major fossil fuel companies. They were at a conference in the Vatican, and he spoke quite sternly to them and said, yes, civilization requires energy, but energy use must not destroy civilization. And he said to them, you have no right to do this to future generations, and you must find alternative ways of doing business and providing energy for the world. So he was quite strong on these points. One thing that really helped me at the climate pilgrimage and after that was that the organizer of the pilgrimage is a well-known climate activist called Yeb Sanyo. Um, he's chair of the board of the Laudato Si movement, and he was once a climate negotiator for the Philippines himself. Um, he said, our physical destination is COP24, but our real destination is the mind and hearts of all those we meet on this road. And I think that's important to remember because if you go to a COP or even if you're following the negotiations when they're taking place, you'll come away from it feeling quite depressed, despairing, wondering where do we go to from here? It's not an easy space to be in. However, being involved in faith-based activism, I think has really taught me um, around the momentum that's created. So the momentum that's created on a pilgrimage like the one I experienced, where you're meeting with groups and people at the grassroots, and this momentum starts to build, and you are trying to touch minds and hearts along the way. Um, so yes, we must stay connected to the COP. We don't abandon the process because it's the only international agreement that we really have. So we must stay with it. Um, but we must also be involved in other things alongside the COP because the progress in that space is so terribly slow, and some would even say corrupted by the groups that are present there. So it's just something to keep in mind, and I'll explain what we were up to in Belém as well in the next 5 minutes. Before I get to Belém, a little bit of context. Last October, there was a conference held in Rome to celebrate the 10th anniversary of Laudato Si. So some of you may have seen this photograph before because it created a bit of a stir. And Pope Leo was present at that conference. The conference was called Raising Hope. And it was a wonderful 3 days in Castel Gandolfo in Rome, where so many people from the Laudato Si movement globally attended. And Pope Leo gave a wonderful speech at that conference. And I'll just share some of it with you. He said, it's only by returning to the heart that a true ecological conversion can take place, calling for a shift from environmental discourse to lifestyles inspired by faith and love of God. So, again, calling us to look into our hearts, to return to the heart, and to tap into that sense of conversion, of change, of a metanoia that we need to turn things around. He also said that the challenges identified in Laudato Si are even more relevant today than they were 10 years ago. And he finished with a question. He said, I would like to conclude with a question that concerns each of us. God will ask us if we have cultivated and cared for the world that he created, for the benefit of all and for future generations, and if we've taken care of our brothers and sisters. What will be our answer? So we were just quite ecstatic to have Pope Leo at this conference, that so many different organizations and groups were involved in, organized by the Laudato Si movement. Um, and he just affirmed that, he's going to carry on that legacy of Pope Francis in terms of encouraging ecological action and ecological justice. He blessed a piece of ice at the conference. This ice was from Greenland. It was part of a glacier that had broken away. It was brought to the conference by a group of artists, and it was part of a wider ritual that took place with the Pope, where waters from different continents were blessed um, and poured, and this water turned into a symbolic river of hope. And this river of hope was what brought us to Belém. So there was such, I suppose, an an outpouring of interest in this river of hope, and in this blessed water, which had kind of the ritual moved people from the water of tears over what's happening to our world into this river of hope. I think it highlighted for me the importance of ritual and symbolic action. So the Laudato Si movement and myself and Trocaire and other groups um, decided it would be worth bringing these these symbols and these actions to COP30. So what you see there is part of the River of Hope, this blue cloth, 40 meters long, and a file of water from that iceberg, which completely melted during the course of the conference, and we were left with hundreds of liters of blessed glacial ice water. Um, and just some words spoken by the Pope at the conference. Lord of life, bless this water. May it awaken our hearts, cleanse our indifference, soothe our grief, and renew our hope. So this is what brought us to Belém. And I just for 5 more minutes, if it's all right to take that time, share with you what we got up to in Belém, because it gives a taste of, I suppose, that faith-based advocacy that I've been talking about. We attended many interfaith events. There was a huge presence around the COP in Belém of the interfaith community. This opening event in a local Lutheran church, where over 300 people gathered from lots of different faith communities. And we were asked these questions. Where do we want to go? How are we going to get there? And what inspiration from our traditions will help us? And there was this beautiful sharing, mostly on our scriptures and spirituality, around caring for the earth. Another interfaith event at a central park in downtown Belém, and the wall that you see at the top is actually the inside of the grounds of the one of the Brazilian bishops' conferences, which had messages for COP30, um, just plastered all around it. When we were inside COP30, we had a moment where the River of Hope on the right was unfolded down through the main corridor of the COP venue. Now, this was quite a significant moment, again, just a sign of symbolic action. Um, there was a live broadcast with We Don't Have Time, who you may be familiar with, talking about this Vatican conference and Pope Leo's words to COP30 and beyond that. And as that was happening, we unfolded this river of hope down through what is a very dystopian space. You can see how grey the inside of the COP30 venue is. And we were singing and chanting and sharing this river of hope with people, and there was great interest in it. Um, so again, this, I suppose, symbolic action or peaceful protest was very much part of our days there. Another moment at COP that was significant for the faith community was where the Global South Bishops' Pastoral Letter, which is called A Call for Climate Justice and the Common Home, Ecological Conversion, Transformation and Resistance to False Solutions. So this was, I suppose, launched prior to the COP, but it made quite a few headlines in that the cardinals and bishops presented the content of that letter at COP30. And it calls for a decisive end to fossil fuels, a rejection of false green solutions, fair and accessible climate finance, and a focused transition to renewable energy. So these were the leaders of our church, particularly the leaders of the Global South, bringing forward um, serious calls for urgent climate action, an end to the fossil fuel industry, just transition, and so forth. And the main protest that happens at all COPs is on the middle Saturday. And you can see in the middle picture here, we took our River of Hope down the main street with us. About 70,000 people apparently took part in that protest. On the right, you'll see there was a funeral for coal, oil, and gas. We weren't involved in that, but I thought it was quite creative. And the photo on the left is of a procession that took place for the eco martyrs of Amazonia. In it was a very, very moving pilgrimage that took place to the local cathedral. And you can see we brought our Pope Leo and the iceberg and our River of Hope with us to that space. I think COP30 gives you a great chance to meet with your representatives. So there would have been various meetings with the Holy See delegation, because of course the Vatican votes as a state, as a member of the COP negotiations. And then just for the Irish context, we would have had a similar meeting with our own politicians. And these are just your opportunities for civil society to engage with the representatives of the various states inside the COP. To see what they are saying, to see how the negotiations are doing, and it just you have that observer status in the sense of we're watching what's happening, and when we go home, we will be holding you to account that you are doing what you've said you will do, and so on. And the final action, sorry, one I skipped there was there was these people's determined commitments presented to the environmental minister of Brazil, Minister de Silva at COP30. So this is an initiative of the Ladada Sea movement. It's a very grassroots initiative where people are asked to make their own commitments. So if we're asking the COP to do one thing, what are we doing on the ground and what are we committing to? So these were presented to Minister de Silva. And finally, the Pope's message to COP30 was presented um, as well. So we would have stood outside the COP venue and made that message accessible to people, promoting it. But he says there, the Paris Agreement, adopted in 2015, has driven real progress and remains our strongest tool for protecting people and planet. But we must be honest, it is not the agreement that's failing. We are failing in our response. What is failing is the political will of some. So again, just highlighting that the urgency of the solutions are not matching the urgency of the crisis. Other things that happen around the COP are always very interesting. So a friend of mine, A.G. Sanyo, who's a fellow climate pilgrim, calls himself an artivist, so activism through his art. And he would have created these beautiful murals around the city, this one in a local Augustinian parish in Belém, celebrating Pope Francis and Laudato Si as well. And it just says there were 9 cardinals present at COP30, more than 40 bishops from 14 countries, from 5 continents, 8 representatives from the Holy See, dozens of national and international Catholic organizations, and more than 1,000 representatives directly involved with the process. So it just highlights from a church perspective the presence of the church there, and you can broaden that out across a lot of other faith groups, particularly we would have met people from Sikh tradition, Muslim, Buddhist as well, and of course the indigenous communities where it was so important that the voices of Amazonia were heard at this COP. Um, so what happened in terms of the policy side of things of COP30, just very briefly, there was a win on the crucial issue of just transition. So there was long overdue language on protecting the rights of workers, Indigenous people, and communities, but there's a lot of other justice issues remaining there. And the final text does nothing to keep us within that 1.5 degree of warming. So there was totally inadequate contributions, or what they call NDCs, nationally determined commitments, ahead of COP31. And this is coming from our policy advisor in Trocaire, Sinead Loughran, said to reach the final day of negotiations without fossil fuels being mentioned demonstrates the immense power and dominance of the fossil fuel industry in supporting states. So as I said at the beginning, 1 in every 25 people at COP was a fossil fuel lobbyist. So finally, and I will stop at this point, the winner at COP30 for me was the coalition of the willing. Countries who are as frustrated as we are with the lack of progress at COP, and a coalition has formed around bringing into being a fossil fuel treaty that would be separate to COP. So this month, an historic month for fossil fuel um, for fossil fuel treaty. The governments of Colombia and the Netherlands are co-hosting the first international conference on a just transition away from fossil fuels. And this is calling for a treaty to come into being that would stop exploration for more fossil fuel projects. So it just says there that we need a concrete binding plan to end the expansion of coal, oil, and gas projects. So if you go onto fossilfueltreaty.org, you can sign in support of this treaty as an individual, as a community, but ideally we want countries to sign. So 45 countries have already committed to attending this first conference, which will take place in Santa Marta in Colombia this month. And this is a response to the slow progress at COP. And it's just a hugely exciting moment. So I'd really encourage people to go onto the Fossil Fuel Treaty website and follow this month what's happening around the Fossil Fuel Treaty as well. The other thing that COP instigates in each country around the world is that there are always mobilizations taking place. So while we were at COP in Brazil, these are our fellow activists here in Dublin on the streets the same time we were at that protest. They had taken to the streets to call for climate action nationally and internationally. And this happened in every country around the world during COP30. So action at the grassroots, so important. The photos here you'll see are interfaith groups coming together for climate action as well. There's a few links there. I'm happy to share these slides with you afterwards, but they're basically the theological reflections that have been produced in relation to why we should support the fossil fuel treaty. If you'd like to read more on them, they're there. But maybe just to come back to Pope Leo's quote, and he says, God will ask us if we've cultivated and cared for the world that he created, and if we've taken care of our brothers and sisters, what will our answer be? And I think we were all struck this week with the Artemis 2 mission. And, this is what we're fighting for, a safe and livable planet for the generations to come and for the whole Earth community to flourish. So just a reminder from Pope Francis there that truly much can be done. So I'll stop there and we can come to some questions. Sorry, I've gone a bit over time.
No, thank you very much. And I'm going to ask Evelyn and Kara to turn on their cameras and mics so that they can ask questions. The one question for clarification I wanted to ask as they're doing that is, did those 1,600 lobbyists for fossil fuel companies get to be in the building and in the room?
Yes, they're in the building. They're in the blues. They call it the blue zone, and you have to have accreditation to get in there. And you can only get accreditation from your government. So countries have given these passes to these
To
lobbyists.
the lobby. Okay,
So
so it's not
yeah,
like at the UN where ECOSOC, right? NGOs can also be in the.
yeah, like you can't. So we're there as NGOs, like civil society space. So there might be a mix of that going on, but I know there's a campaign called Kick the Polluters Out.
Mhm.
And I know one of the things they are trying to do is to ensure that countries do not give these passes to people associated with the fossil fuel industry. So there might be a mix there, but there's certainly an element of it where they are going in under their as country observers or delegations. Yeah.
So they get to be that. That's the one question I had because again, when you put all the faith groups together, right, they're a formidable number.
Hmm.
Um, but they don't have the access that the lobbyists have. Um,
No.
so shifting to, I'll start with Evelyn and then Kara to give your questions. And if you could just state what year you are in program at St. John's, a little about yourself.
All right, lovely. I'm Evelyn. I'm a sustainability major at St. John's. I'm in my junior year. I have one more semester after this. As
Yeah.
we were talking, I'm thinking kind of about U.S. policies, not just international, because the U.S. plays such a huge role in our pollution. Just our like war industry alone is one of the
Mm,
biggest polluters on Earth. And I think climate advocacy is very interconnected with human advocacy. I think part of the reason we're seeing not as much as we want to say, that this is urgent, a lot of the communities affected are poor people. And even in the US on a smaller scale, if we see
mm,
like redlining districts where it's just minority and poor people, they have less green spaces, they have industries moving in, like oil industries that are polluting that environment, but there's less of a urgency because they don't have as much say so because they're more poor. Um, and I think, I don't know if you know about Citizens United, but the fact that it's when corporations, essentially in the US, corporations can donate as much as they want to a campaign and
hmm.
it's legal and it's
Oh yeah.
essentially legal bribery. So a lot of these politicians are kind of like the corporations have these politicians in their pocket and they have a lot of people at least in the US as citizens. And I believe that they have more of the interest of these corporations that are kind of donating a lot of money. And, even the people who are making these policies and shaping these policies have stocks in these fossil fuel companies, which makes it that much harder. So it's not just the lobbyists, it's the politicians themselves. So I kind of like, what do you think that we should be doing kind of about that to make
Mm.
that shift where we hold these politicians accountable? Because of course, it's not just in the US, but the US is like such a huge contributor to the pollution we're seeing right now.
Yeah, thanks. It's a really great question. Um, I think anything, just first to acknowledge like your opening statement about the link between fossil fuel industry and poverty and what's driving this whole crisis now and the war in Iran and all of these things, like it's so interconnected. Um, these fuels are holding the world to ransom right now, and if they weren't there, you know, what uh, that we might find something else to fight over, but I think we need to urgently get off this stuff. It's killing us in lots of ways. And it is the most vulnerable people in almost every country. It's the most vulnerable people who will suffer. And whether that's in terms of the shift to cleaner energy, that maybe doesn't include protection for the rights of workers or doesn't acknowledge their human rights. Um, for example, that letter I shared about the Global South bishops, I mean, it's an amazing letter, pastoral letter from the Global South bishops. I gave it one slide. You could have 10 presentations on it. But one of the things the cardinal from the DRC was so strong about at COP30 was what's happening to people in his country as we mine for cobalt and lithium and all of these things we need to make the transition to renewables in some cases. So he was very concerned about the human rights issues there. He agreed with the need for the transition, but he wanted protection for his people in that process. It was really powerful to hear him speak. So just to acknowledge that. What can we do about all of this? I mean, I'm a climate activist. So we have a climate strike in Dublin every Friday, and it's in its 380th week, so it's 6 years of climate protest. And we're very few. There might be 5 people, there might be 10 people, or there might be a swelling into a few thousand, like we saw for the COP30 demo. So, like I say to people, turn up to spaces where you meet like-minded people and you can talk about this stuff. It's so important, and things happen in those spaces. The other thing that's happening around fossil fuels within the church and within all faith groups is a divestment from the fossil fuel industry. So this is where people are campaigning for institutions, and it could be a university or it could be a church, a diocese, or a, a bishop's conference nationally can divest their assets from the fossil fuel industry. So, for example, the church would never invest in anything to do with making weapons. It would be immoral. It would be against the teaching of the church. We now need to think in the same way with fossil fuels. So there's a huge global divestment campaign going on where faith groups have become the largest grouping of institutions that are removing their assets from the fossil fuel industry. I'll put the link in the chat in a minute, but there's a website called divestmentdatabase.org. And when you go on there, if you're having a bad day, it's good to go on there and you'll see the trillions of dollars that have been taken out of the fossil fuel industry in the last 10 years, thanks to this divestment movement. 35% of the groups who are divesting, the largest grouping in the global divestment movement, are faith institutions across all faiths. So, what can you do? Has your diocese divested? I know the answer to this in the US because no diocese in the US has divested yet. In Ireland, half of our dioceses are divested in it, but it's a long process and it's a work in progress. So, I think it's finding out what's going on globally and then saying, right, well, how can I chip away at that wall here where I am? And the same for any faith group, that could be something that can be worked on. So, we need the grassroots to make the bigger stuff happen. And I suppose not to forget the power you have as well as a voter, as an activist, as someone who might decide to campaign on the fossil fuel treaty or divestment. Um, so a very long-winded answer. I hope that helps a little bit.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much for your time today and that wonderful presentation. My name is Cara Dunleavy. I'm studying environmental sustainability and decision making. I'm a senior, so I'm so close to the finish line. Um, and I have two questions, but I'll leave another one for later if we have more time. But I guess I this year kind of a theme for myself has been the intersection of religion and politics or policy. So what can we expect as maybe like the future involvement of church or even religion as a whole? What would that maybe look like or hope to look like? And then as a follow-up to that, how are people so far responding to the involvement of religion? Because I know that can be kind of a hot topic or in some eyes a risky move to bring into international like politics. But then also what's like the most surprising thing that you've seen come out of this as well?
Mm. Yeah, thanks. The reaction's been really positive, I think, and also people are really surprised. They're like, "Whoa, what's the church doing here?" I think surprise and positivity. Not the funny thing. I mean, it's obvious. The our common home piece of this is so relevant because it's the one issue that I think every faith can work together on. I mean, maybe there are others, but there is this natural alignment, obviously, because we share one planet, one home, um, and it's just so beautiful to see all these groups come together and share this beautiful spirituality, from their traditions on a particular topic, like this. Um, so that's another thing to say. What can we hope to see in the future? I mean, I've I don't know. I'm really impressed right now with how the Laudato Si movement um, has managed to encourage the leaders of the church to get behind the fossil fuel treaty. Like that's huge. There was a webinar last month where you had all of the continent bishops conference come together. I'm sorry, North America wasn't there, but it was the only one who wasn't there. Next time they'll be there. So the other intercontinental is the word I'm looking for, intercontinental bishops conference. The cardinals who run those conferences came onto a webinar with the Laudato Si movement and put their weight behind the fossil fuel treaty. And there's a whole theological framework for why they would do that. That is huge to me. And it also gives Catholics permission to, on the ground, lobby their politicians to say, our country needs to sign this treaty now. It's urgent. The other thing I can see happening is COP31 is in Turkey, and that's exciting to me because um, for for Catholics, we've Laudato Si, which is a gift to the whole world, not just to Catholics. But the Muslim community a few years ago launched Al Mizan, a treaty for the earth. And there's a whole website, you can look it up. And it's basically inspired by Laudato Si. And it is something that we should be exploring together as faith groups. So I'd hope that in the run up to COP31 in Turkey, we could have a coming together of Christian and Muslim communities around these two documents and to come together more clearly on what we'd like to see happen in Turkey. Um, you've billions of people in the world, probably half the world's population if you put those two groups together, but not everyone is aware of them, of the documents that exist or the inspiration that exists for this work. But we have access to communities. We have there's a mobilization that can happen that I think is unique when faith groups get together. The other thing I'll say about this is the divestment piece is really promising as well because um, if you think even in the United States, like how many Catholic universities are there? That on its own, if they were to divest together, like it's not so much about the money, it's more about the witness of it because you're saying to the fossil fuel industry, your product is no longer viable. Like it's a stranded asset. The world knows we have to get off this. So what you consider to be an asset actually is no longer. And when groups start to move away from it in terms of their investments and they're putting that investment elsewhere, um, the days are numbered for that particular product that we need to urgently get off. So um, they might sound like really big things, but it's all dependent on people at the grassroots taking something like the fossil fuel treaty and saying, do you know what, I'm going to get my parish to sign this, and then I'm going to get another parish to sign it, and then maybe my diocese will sign it, and then, oh, look over here, they're interested in divestment. It's we all chip away where we can. So yeah.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question each.
All right. Well, I really liked your answer and talking more about grassroots organizations. Um, Definitely, I think when we talk about just in relation to what we're saying about the environment and its effects on people, part of it, to me, seems purposeful. If we look at war right now, it is purposeful. Like destroying someone's environment is a purposeful thing. It's like it's a form of a weapon, I guess. If you can harm people's water source
Yeah.
or the soil they use to grow the food. Um, so I guess for larger scale issues such as that, there's different things that we can do. We can do like sit-ins, we can do different protests. We
Hmm.
can, stop investing in certain things, of course. But for things where it's like our infrastructure relies on fossil fuels, everything, like
Hmm.
the plastic we use, it's everywhere. It's everywhere. It's in when we go to the hospital, it's in the syringes, it's in the plastic bags, it's in the chairs we're sitting on, when we use the bus, that's fossil fuels, the electricity, the lights, it's in everything. So what do you think needs to be done? Like what can the church do to and other organizations do together to kind of shift this infrastructure? Because we see so many coalitions formed,
Mm.
and we see even with the Paris Agreement, like them just moving back the dates, right? It's like, oh, we'll do it by this day in this year, and it doesn't happen, so they push it back.
Hmm.
So what can we do to hold these people accountable? And what can we do like on the individual level, more than just sitting in and protesting? Like what can we do for our
Yeah.
community and beyond?
Yeah, thanks, Evelyn. And it's hugely difficult. Like none of this is easy because you're talking about huge systematic change, and it's our governments who have to make the systematic change. So, like, I go into parishes and I give lots of presentations about X, Y, and Z. And I can feel the tension in the room, and people are like, "But how can I?" So I always say to people, like this, I'd never lay the blame on fossil fuels at an individual's doorstep because it's huge systematic change that's needed. Sorry, one second. Excuse me one second. Sorry about that. I think my voice is actually gone for a second. Do you want to ask another question? Because it might come back in a minute. Yeah.
Yeah, so I this one's a little like this pertains a little bit more to the US and kind of our status and involvement. But as of early 2026, the Trump administration is attempting to withdraw from the UNFCCC, essentially like making our status like legally contingent or pending. How does this kind of impact the goals? So like if a country, because I understand right now that it mostly is the US that has trouble deciding what they want to be involved with or not, but at a broader scope, any type of country that has either shifting governments or terms, how does that affect the goals when you consistently have almost an inconsistent reaction from these countries?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Hope my voice holds out for the end of this. But sorry. So the US pulling out is a massive blow because you're talking about one of the biggest polluters in the world. Um, but I think it's really important that obviously other countries to stay in because you have this coalition of the willing. But the other thing that kind of excites me around that is there are groups who have come together in the US and formed a coalition called We're Still In. Have you heard of this, Megan? And I think there's like 80,000 different groups represented in that, right? Like between like there's some states, universities and so on. And that says to me, this is not what the people want um, for the US to pull out. And I think hopefully the tide will shift on that national political stance, one would hope eventually, and that the space that the We're Still In coalition is holding would 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 uh, would come into being and would come into action and really stand up. The other person who was at the Raising Hope conference in Rome alongside Pope Leo was Arnold Schwarzenegger. So they were on stage together. It was quite hilarious. And he gave a very cheesy speech, which was really, really good. But he gave the example of California when people said to him, it can't be done. You can't have a thriving economy and a green state. And he gave various examples of how they had turned it around. Um, and his main point was like, don't listen to the naysayers, just get on with it. And I think there's an element of that in this. Like the bigger picture looks quite grim when you stand back and say, well, countries are backing out, look at the rise in emissions, why are you still engaged with this? Um, but I think it's really important to keep chipping away at that wall. And I know that sounds like a short answer, but this is also where faith comes in as well, because someone said to me once, the faith-based climate activists are going to have the longest staying power in this because there's a well that's needed to draw on. And I often say to people, we're in the Good Friday of this right now, but we know that that's not the end of the story either. So I think there's a few things that need to happen in terms of the grassroots not giving up and coalitions of people coming together. And that could be through the Advocacy movement, that could be through other faith groups that are out there. It could be through local coalitions. I mean, look at the marches that are taking place around the US right now on lots of issues. So, like, that's a sign of people saying, no, we're not going to stand for what's happening right now. And, but it's not easy and you're in it for the long haul. And I think you need to find the piece of it that you want to address. So, do I want to work on divestment or do I want to focus in more on restoring biodiversity, or do I want to join the sit-ins? What about the fossil fuel treaty? So I think you find your space within it, and then put your energy in there, you know.
Well, and in doing so too, we remember, right, that we're all in it together. And
Yeah.
so, right, I don't have to do, I mean, and this is what I think faith-based groups also bring to the faith traditions, all of them bring to the table, which is a vision that is just profoundly communitarian, right? It is our common home, right? We're communities of people. And so you don't have this it's overwhelming the problem, but it's not all on any of our shoulders individually, right? And so this kind of I can have my part and do my part, knowing that I'm part of the bigger community where other people are acting too. And then um the Jesuits have this saying, AD and for the greater glory of God. It's called the Magis.
Mhm.
And a Jesuit once said to me that kind of it's for the greater, not for the greatest, because this kind of superlatives, trying for perfection, is paralyzing. None of us in this world can reach perfection, but we can make things a little bit better. And if we all do our part to make things a little bit better, then it we can see a measurable difference. I want to thank you, Jane, and thank you for clearly your
Sorry about
hopefully you'll
that.
go have a cup of tea. And thank you to Evelyn and Cara for spending the hour with us. Thank you to everyone who logged on to watch today and the students that will watch once it gets uploaded onto YouTube. Everybody have a lovely afternoon.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Yeah.